Recovery Sort Of is a podcast where we discuss recovery topics from the perspective of people living in long-term recovery. This podcast does not intend to represent the views of any particular group, organization, or fellowship. The attitudes expressed are solely the opinion of its contributors. Be advised, there may be strong language or topics of an adult nature.
Welcome back. It's Recovery Sort Of. I am Jason, and it's quite possible I could be considered a sexaholic.
And I'm Billy. I'm a person in long-term recovery.
I'm Jenny. I'm also a person in long-term recovery.
And today we have Rick with us. Hi, Rick.
Hi, I am Rick, and I am a sexaholic along with a recovering alcoholic and workaholic.
Oh, man. Yeah, I got a few of those holics myself, that's for sure. We're here to explore the program of Sexaholics Anonymous. That is why we have Rick. Before I go blabbering and getting into anything, I think we should just let Rick tell us a good 5 to 8 minute version of his lifetime story of why he's here to talk about this.
All right. As I said, I'm a recovering alcoholic and a sexaholic. Alcohol was in my family. I actually learned to walk to beer cans thrown on the beach. And that was a folklore in my family for years. But the biggest problem was then I was 16 when I found my dad's 8mm movies that were in black and white, porn movies, stag flicks, I think they used to call them. And I can remember showing them on my basement. I found them. It was kind of buried in the back. And when nobody was home, I would go down and put one on and sit on the concrete floor, showing it against a wall. It was like this, now I should say it sounds like what an incredibly crazy idea, but that was where I started. And when I was 18, then my dad gave me Playboy. So I had a, subscription to Playboy. So magazines started getting in it, and it was just the go-to area. I had that, that feeling that I wasn't enough, so that, here I could be the master of my own fate, especially with women. I was kind of shy, so, I wasn't the big stud that I saw everybody else think they were. And so, but I could be the master of my own universe with pornography or on the movies. And so it just kept going. And then, of course, I got married after grad school. So I thought, the cure. Now I don't need any of that because, I can have 24, as some people in the program will say, 24 sex. And, of course, that doesn't happen. And that lasted through the 2-week honeymoon into the next week, when my dad and my mom got separated after many years of marriage. And of course, that upset me. So what was I back to? Masturbation and porn, and on and off for many, many years. It turned to be pornography, alcohol, got into strip clubs, and my work was very important. I became a workaholic, and it just became a big mix. I'd work really hard. Well, I deserve a break. What does break mean? Well, strip club. Well, to be friendly, I got to have plenty of alcohol. And it just, and the cycle just got worse and worse. And until 2007, basically my wife had enough. She had caught my porn collection, and instead of thinking, great addict thinking, instead of thinking I had a problem, my problem was I just got to hide it better. Great thinking. But then eventually she caught it and had enough. After 30, we'd been married 36, 37 years, and she kicked me out of the house. And we were separated for about 6 weeks when one Sunday my daughters all three of them were in town, and said, "Hey, Dad, when Mom's at church, why don't you come visit us?" well, that was the setup for an intervention. And it was a really powerful experience. If you've ever seen one, where they read the letters, I was in tears, literally, most of the time. And when the interventionist, who is now one of our close friends, asked, "Are you ready to get recovery?" They had already said they thought they'd have to do at least 2 or 3 rounds. And I said yes. And that afternoon, I was on a plane to Wickenburg, Arizona for a 5-week program that was life-changing. And my last drink was actually July 7th of 2007.
Ooh, congratulations.
Yeah. So, and then when I got there, I thought, well, alcohol's my primary. I knew sex was in there. They said, oh, no, you're a sex addict first. Alcohol is your secondary. And so I did the program for sex addiction. And as soon as I got back, my wife did let me back in the house. It was challenging, but it was, we can make it work. And I found Sexaholics Anonymous. Some people recommended some meetings to me, and I started going and been going ever since.
How challenging was it to find a meeting when you got back to your home?
Actually, because we were also in a church recovery ministry, there were 2 or 3 guys that were already visiting, so I had plenty of resources. Plus, a member of the church, actually, or one of the pastors, was in SA, and he recommended a couple of meetings. So I had plenty of sources, which was very helpful.
I think one of the first things you said that stood out to me was when you were talking about finding those films and kind of like the wacky or not ideal method in which you set them up to try to be able to, watch them. And I was thinking back to, I think my generation, we had like the early cable TV channels that were scrambled, and like every so often you thought you peaked something, and it was like just that I hate to call it addict mentality, but that idea that like we need this so bad, we will accept these minor scraps off the table just to have something.
Oh yeah, I remember. I've heard people talk, and I kind of remember a little bit of it. Or the ones where they're not quite hardcore, but they're softcore. Right. And how can I watch those?
Yeah, like the HBO, they would have the late night, like wasn't quite porn, but kind of very suggestive,
very titillating, as they would say.
Another thing that stood out, and I imagine this makes it's probably getting better and changing in our world now, but just especially hearing it come from you talking about coming of age at 18. I would imagine it's really tricky in our society to be able to recognize sex addiction, because we kind of champion this idea that like part of coming of age for boys is sort of like women and nudity and sex and all these things. It's like, oh, you're finally ready, bud. Here's your Playboy subscription. Or, hey, let's go to the strip club because you turned 18, or let's go out for a beer because you turned 21. Like, we sort of champion some of these ideas. And I would imagine when you're coming of age and you're just confused by life and trying to figure it out, there's probably a lot of mixed messages about, am I unhealthy or am I just like all these other guys that I hear talking?
Well, you have that, but the problem is also cell phones.
Yeah.
I did some research. The average age a boy finds hardcore pornography. Guess?
8.
6.
7.
Wow, 7.
I mean, I at 16, I had a hard enough time processing it.
Right.
What's a 7-year-old do with? I mean, not porn that in my day it was. It wasn't.
Right.
I mean, now it is really, really explicit. And what is a 7-year-old? How does he process it?
Right.
But and then the male culture, buck up, be a man. Being a man is being with women, all of that. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And as you say that, like, I have an 8-year-old little adorable boy at my house, and like picturing him stumbling across some of the things that we know exist that are out there. It's just like, yeah, that's scary and sad at the same time. You also mentioned this idea that I don't think we talk about a lot, or at least I haven't heard much about in the 12-step groups that I've gone to, but kind of like this one addiction almost helping and reinforcing another, right? Because you had a hard day with your workaholic addiction, right? But then you were like, well, now I get to treat myself. And then you say, well, I'm going to treat myself by going to the strip club and blowing off some steam. Well, but that's about talking to people. So now I also need to involve the alcohol. And it was really fascinating to hear. And I would imagine if I was to probably explore my life from that lens, there's probably also a lot of these ways that addictive pieces or the obsessions or the search for relief kind of overlap and reinforce themselves, man. That makes it really tricky to get out, because that old theory of like, hey, just stop one at a time. It's too much to stop everything. And
yeah, and that's one of the reasons the rehab I went to, the interventionist picked, because it dealt with multiple addictions.
Mm-hmm.
That is an issue, because in SA, in a couple of the groups I'm in, especially, I noticed that early on, probably 40 to 50% or more were recovering alcoholics. And some of them had 15, 20 years of sobriety in AA. And then I hear, I've been in the program 2 years and I got 6 months of sobriety. And I'm thinking, okay, they got clean, sober.
Mm-hmm.
But they just switched addictions.
Right.
And it just, that I've heard it called the whack-a-mole, whack one and something else pops up.
Mm-hmm.
What do people in SA call your sobriety? They call it sobriety?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, sexaholics get sobriety.
Yeah, I've actually heard somebody said I've been, clean, but yeah, we call it sobriety, sober.
I had heard another person along my journey that really, really felt like it was powerful for them to have someone tell them that drugs weren't their quote unquote main addiction. It was actually sex addiction. And the way they described it for me, it's not that in the moment, the drug addiction was probably more interruptive to their life or more unmanageable, more destructive. But when they traced it back, the sex addiction came first. And they said it for a lot of people, that's true, right? We think of like porn or masturbation. You're talking 7 when people are being exposed to it. I'm thinking, I don't know, 11, 12. That seems like the pretty typical stage of development. Even though it wasn't as destructive, it had its roots early. Like they were seeking that relief early. And then drugs just became kind of the next extension of that. Did you feel like hearing that was, I guess just in this sense that we just talked about, you said that allowed you to address it much sooner in your recovery, which is beautiful. Do you think that's an important thing that maybe more of us need to hear, this idea that maybe sex addiction is I don't want to say the primary, but like the precursor almost? It
could be. Certainly in the program, I've run into a lot of people who were sexually abused and sex became a big deal. And, they used it, but then they had alcohol or drugs also to medicate those feelings. And yes, they saw that the alcohol and drugs were clearly a problem, but sex addiction probably was their base addiction. And part of the problem, I think, is, an alcoholic, most of them, pretty much everybody in the family and your friends know it.
Right.
Same way, drugs. You come in glassy-eyed and red-eyed, pretty much they know you got a problem. But you can watch porn for 8 hours. How's anybody going to know?
Right.
So it's easier hidden. And, we don't. And again, we get clean from sobriety. If I go to people that I meet and say, oh, I've been sober 15 and a half years, from alcohol. Oh, man, great job. Same way with, drugs and drug addicts. I've heard, they get praised. Most everybody gets praised. Sex addiction, sadly, people will look at you, and actually I've seen people almost take a step back. They don't want to get, what you've got, sadly. And they're loving people. It just has a very negative connotation.
It's so fascinating because my initial entrance into recovery was through the 12-step program of Narcotics Anonymous specifically. And I remember going there early on and thinking, we are like a bunch of IV using drug addicts. We are like the scum of the earth in this basement. This is as low as it gets, right? And then over some years, feeling more comfortable with it, we were just people, whatever. It was fine. And then with like 10 years, seeking some therapy at one point, and the therapist recommending I go to a sex addiction program. Which ended up being, I explored SAA, Sex Addicts Anonymous, and then Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. And I never made it around to Sexaholics Anonymous. I always wanted to, but I think there was a piece of it that bothered me, which we'll probably get into. But the fascinating part was the only real meeting near me was on a Friday night in the same building that a NA meeting was going on at. And when I went to drive there, I thought, oh, my God, I can't let these NA people see me going into this other meeting. Right. And there's this connotation, right? Sex addict. The initially thing that comes to my mind, even as an open-minded guy, is pervert, pedophile, plays with children. And so, like, it's just so hard to break that stigma because I think that's the first place people's minds go. And it's, I got to be honest, I would imagine in your role in your life now, that might even be more looked at that way. That's scary.
Yeah, it can be. And the words you just used, we did the recovery ministry I had at church. I actually had the group, and when we talked about sex addiction and we did a group teaching a couple of weeks, I asked them, when I said those words, what came to mind? And all three of those were some of the first that came out.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
The rehab I was at, it was shocking to me that the alcoholics, man, they were on top. The codependents were right there. Drug addicts, well, you're kind of maybe second class. But you sex addicts, you are in the basement.
Yes.
And, I said, wait a minute. We all have addiction.
Right.
How can there be this pecking order? But there was. Yeah. Even there.
Right.
So how does general society, what are they going to think?
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting concept that we have so much stigma and hangups around this idea of sex addiction. And don't get me wrong. The worst, ugliest, most tragic instances, they may look like those labels, right? But I would say, at least from my experience, 90% of it looks like I watch too much porn and it's making my life unmanageable in some way. It's hurting my wife. I'm masturbating and it takes away from my sex life and my marriage. Like, it was, I guess, pretty typical or normal sounding things most of the time, which broke my heart for the fact that we all felt so shameful about going and seeking help. Like, we're trying to get better and we still felt shameful going.
Absolutely. I mean, it's scary. In reading, people in their 20s need, help,
right,
to be able to have relations with their wives.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's pretty scary.
Right.
I mean, that's telling you something's, not normal.
Right.
And I mean, that's the sad part. And I can't tell you how many times talking with newcomers, what the issue is. Well, I watch a little bit of porn, and then, I get up at 2, I get up, and my wife and I go to bed at 11. I get up at 12. I'm only going to watch 10 minutes. Next thing I know, it's 4:30 and I got to get up at 6.
Right.
And does that interfere with your life? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the other parts of it. I mean, you got massage parlors in that area, affairs, but pornography has been the biggest one.
Right.
Pat Carnes, who I've read a lot of, if you're, he's, a lot of people call him the guru of sex addiction, said the internet and internet porn was the crack cocaine of sex addiction.
Yeah, he's actually the gentleman that wrote the Gentle Path Through the 12 Steps, which
he admits is the brutal path. I've heard it out of his own mouth, so I'm not.
I believe it. But it's a very thorough book. I enjoyed working through it.
Yeah. So was your family aware of your issues around your sex addiction when they did your intervention? And were you aware that was a big issue for you before your intervention?
I knew, yes, my wife certainly, and my daughter, and my youngest daughter kind of caught me one time. So, I mean, she didn't see me, but I think she suspected what was going on.
Right.
The older daughters weren't in the house at this point, but I think they knew. They knew there was issue with alcohol, the whole thing.
Right.
What did I know? I actually thought probably alcohol was more of an issue that, and that's, that denial that addicts are so famous for. But I didn't see it as disruptive as the alcohol, because alcohol took me out of being present. Sex addiction, it does the same thing, but I didn't recognize it as much. So now at that point, I probably would, as I said, when I got to the rehab, I thought alcohol was my primary.
Do you think that the intervention, maybe I should ask this first, your wife was not at the intervention?
Yeah, she was there.
She was there too?
Oh,
okay.
Yeah. Well, when I walked in, she was there. Okay. That's when I knew something was up.
Do you think that your daughters being involved made it a greater chance of success? Like, did that really sell it to you?
Actually, and two of them were married, so they were sons-in-law.
Wow.
And actually, my one son-in-law was the first. He read the first letter, and his dad had died of alcoholism.
Oh, wow.
So that set the tone. I was already crying.
Right.
And yeah, the pain that I heard from my daughters and my wife. Yeah. I mean, if you've ever seen those, I mean, and people affected, it does affect you. I mean, it was life-changing. It was the toughest day of my life, and yet the best day of my life.
That's awesome. So to get into a little bit of the program, I think, which is what we hope to do here, is to let people know what is there and what it can help with and how it can do it. Going back to just my little bit of experience, I went to SAA first. It was very focused on just the sex addiction piece of it, which, was all I knew at the time, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
It was mostly male, so it felt, at least for me, who part of my interaction was with other women. So that felt really safe for me that it was mostly male. And I ended up choosing that more as my home base because I guess I liked at that time the idea that you and your sponsor and your network kind of come up with what your trouble behaviors are, as opposed to a hard line like, this is what your problem is, stop doing that. And eventually I went to SLAA, and I think at that time I liked the idea more because there is a little bit of that love addiction for me, like that please accept me, please make me feel like enough kind of part. But it felt kind of dangerous because there was more women in their population, I guess, and that didn't feel quite as safe for me with what I was working on. And so I had considered going to SA at one point, and what I had heard, and you can clarify if any of this is true or not, was that generally SA, or Sexaholics Anonymous, was more geared towards married men. And that the idea was any sex outside of that marital agreement was wrong, and that included, masturbation. And I wasn't so sure about that, but maybe you can just talk about, is that true?
Yes, our definition is basically no sex with self or anyone else other than the spouse, and the spouse is considered a female, relationships male and female.
Okay.
And yes, I've heard that. I am familiar with SAA. At the rehab, I actually did the green, yellow, and red circles, and that has some advantages. That was a good tool to know what are good, safe, and enriching things I need to do. The reason SA has been so successful is that it has such a firm bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people will say, well, it's, the definition isn't so welcoming. Yes, I get that. And the founder, Roy Kay, wrote it. That's how the program has been. I'm sure there have been discussions at the intergroup and the higher levels, but people look at it, and I've heard people come in, and some struggle with same-sex attraction, said, I need that firm and definitive bottom.
When you say the way it's written isn't welcoming, I think there's definitely a part of it doesn't seem welcoming to like the LGBTQ community, but are you also referring to, and you described this weird, so when I heard it before, it was just like actual legal marriage, but the way you described it made it sound like maybe there was some space for girlfriends, fiancés, boyfriends.
That's always been a little bit, I'd say, open-ended.
Okay.
Everybody's welcome. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
I mean, we have, you can come in, and there have been people that were in, same-sex marriages, and they realized that they were out of control, and yet they needed that firm bottom for the time being.
Right.
So we're, nobody's going to say, oh, you can't come in.
Right.
So I want to make, it is welcoming. It's just that when I say that is that, yes, there are people that, I've had conversations with when we talk about it is, can't we change it? Well, that, that's up to the fellowship over the, in the future. I don't know. I suspect it probably will stay the way it is.
Right.
And if you're not comfortable, there is SAA.
Right.
I saw that there's actually 5 sex addiction programs.
Oh, what are the other 2?
So there's SA, SAA, SLA. Oh.
Now we want the 2 more.
Yeah.
Okay, let me go back to the internet. But so when you came out of rehab, did you know you wanted SA? You knew you were headed for that program, or was it just convenient because that's what was available?
Actually, I had done some of the literature, and the meetings we did used SLAA literature.
Mm-hmm.
I had the Green Book, which is SAA. I was familiar with SA, and we had talked about it. I had not been able to go to a meeting because you couldn't really leave campus. So when I got involved and talked to people here, there were more SA meetings, and people were they said it's a great program. So I went to my first meeting, and it's actually become my home group. We don't really call it quite the same as AA, but I'd call it that. And it's the group I still, 15 plus years later, if I'm in town, I'm at the meeting. And, I just found that it was, so the people were welcoming and affirming, and they were supportive. So I found, God led me there, I'm sure.
Right. It was funny. So when I was attending SAA, there was probably more people from AA or affiliated with AA than there was from NA. But I did have the thought reading through the SAA literature. I was like, I wonder if the people that go to NA come here for sex addiction help, and if the people that go to AA all go to Sexaholics just because we like the terminology better. Because it did feel like SAA's literature kind of felt like it had read similar to NA's literature. And then I was like, oh, Sexaholic. I'm like, Rick just chose it because he liked the holics. That's why he picked that one.
I mean, the monium are the same, but SA, the White Book, which is what was Roy Kay, the founder, wrote, it reads an awful lot like AA literature. Yeah.
Right. Go ahead, Jen.
Oh, so you were telling me, we were talking before the show, what it's like when you get a newcomer. All are welcome, but it sounds like there's a bit of a vetting process. Could you talk about that?
Oh, when I actually help out on our hotline, the Baltimore area intergroup hotline, because sex addiction has such a shame characteristics, and people, having negative opinions. Occasionally, you get people that are curious, and all SA meetings in our area and in probably most of the country are what's called closed meetings. Yeah. Only those desiring the desire to be sexually sober. And there's a reason, because, we don't want people just coming in curious. Right. It's just very disruptive and probably would take away from the healing that would happen in the meeting. So unlike AA, where, pretty much anybody's welcome, SA, they are closed meetings. So we will ask people, newcomers, why do you think you have a problem? And very few will say, oh, I'm just curious.
Right.
But occasionally you'll sense that, hey, there is some curiosity, and we maybe say, hey, here, why don't you look at another fellowship where the meetings aren't closed?
Right. That's really interesting. I feel like that's a factor that maybe the more typical or traditional 12-step programs don't have to really deal with. It's like an extra step that I wouldn't have considered, but I appreciate that it's being done, because, yeah, that there is some really sensitive information that can be shared there, or not shared if there's, investigative journalists in the back row.
Absolutely.
Curious
I can't tell you how many times in the 15 years that I've been in a meeting and a guy, and I've gotten to know him, and all of a sudden he'll say something. He said, I thought I'd take this to the grave, and share something that was so, he'd been carrying around.
Right.
And he shared it, and you can almost see the weight come off of him. I mean, they're almost different people, because, so they're, especially if they were sexually abused.
Right.
I mean, that's for males especially. I think, I'm supposed to buck up and handle all of this, and so I'm not going to share that with anybody.
Right. Right.
Is it mostly male?
Yeah. SA, the majority of the meetings are almost 100%. We do have some women in SA. They've been reaching out, and again, I think it's, if it's shameful for males, I think it's even probably worse for women.
Yeah, no, I agree.
To admit it. Now, the rehab I went to had a group that was strictly women, and there were almost as many women as there were men in the weeks I was there. So it's there.
Right.
It's just that, it's difficult, and there aren't enough women to be able to have women's only meetings. And that's hopefully something that is changing. In the Baltimore area, we have been looking to try to create a women's only meeting.
That's a weird thing to hope for. Like, I hope there's more women who are taking sex.
Well, I know that they have the problem, so it's not like
right.
I hope that they get sex addiction. Right. I know there already exists. It just hopefully they can start to get some help.
Yeah. I found the other programs.
What are they?
Yeah, so it's Sex Addicts Anonymous, Sex and Love Addiction Anonymous, Sexual Compulsives Anonymous.
Oh, I've never heard of that.
Sexaholics Anonymous, Sexual Recovery Anonymous.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I've never heard of those two.
So there's five to pick from, 5 flavors.
I wonder if those other two even have their own kind of distinct flavor or touch to them, because that's what I noticed about the couple I went to, like SAA. I heard that SA was like 100% male, and SAA was like 98.7% male. You know, we'd have like a woman every so often, but then SLAA seemed very split, and in fact, they did have women's only meetings in Baltimore. This was 4 or 5 years ago, last I checked, but yeah, it is. I wonder what those other two are, and if they're just new
I've
and
heard of them, but
burgeoning.
I don't know enough about them, so
Right.
can't really speak to it.
Oh, so does SA follow the traditional 12-step, 12 tradition model? Is that
Oh,
how it's
absolutely.
based?
I mean, the only change from the 12 steps is instead of alcohol, it's I'm powerless over lust.
Okay.
Oh, is that what it says?
Yeah, that's the and Roy wrote about, you know, yes, sex addiction, you know, porn and all that, and when he wrote it, you know, internet porn hadn't come out, so it wasn't. But affairs and all that are up here, but underneath is lust, which is that unnatural use of something that was natural. Sex is, you know, hey, we're born with the desire for sex,
right,
but we use it in a very unnatural way,
right,
and that's how he kind of defines, and it's very lengthy, but that's a brief nutshell of it.
Well, I'm always curious in the 12-step, 12 tradition model. So it's always, how do they differentiate the first step? And then what about like the fifth tradition? Like in NA, that's the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop using. Do you know what they use for a fifth? Is it similar?
Yeah, very.
Tradition?
It's I can't remember the exact. It's this basically to stay sexually sober.
Yeah, and I guess that gets more into what are the sort of qualifications for membership or for, you know, people coming, like what specific criteria fit, you know, well into that program.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you're struggling with, you know, as I said, probably now 80%, 90% are struggling with internet porn. That's, you know, but they're still, you know, and a lot of them will have had an affair or strip clubs or massage parlors, but most of them recognize, you know, the internet porn's probably their go-to.
So just a quick fact check. Each group has but one primary purpose: to carry its message to the sexaholic who still suffers, which sounds like what Rick came up with. That was perfect. Yeah, I was going to ask Rick right around that same time, just to try to get into this idea. Like, does Sexaholics Anonymous pretty much follow with Alcoholics Anonymous with kind of the way they conceptualize what's going on? You know, like this is a spiritual malady or a spiritual disease, and that the treatment comes from the same place. And that, like, I love the way when you said that, you know, we all have this lust, and that it's just kind of what I heard. I know these weren't the words you used, but like blown out of proportion because of the other things we're struggling with. That feels like what I learned about in the 6th step with my character defects, right? Like these are normal human traits, but because of the way I feel about myself and I interact with the world, I do them to an extent that doesn't feel typical or normal anymore. So I guess I was just wondering, like, is pretty much the entirety of the program very similar to the feel of AA and what they say the problem is and how we work on it?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. I mean, I went to AA meetings for the first few years.
Oh, okay.
Because of, you know, I also knew I was a recovering alcoholic.
Right.
And yes, it all addiction is a spiritual disease. You know, I'm very convinced of that. And being connected to a higher power, however you define it, for me, it's God, is so important. And yes, character defects, you know, are a big part of it. And those things that, you know, you can say, you know, affected us from our youth, a lot of it, a family of origin, right. You know, those things that we don't like about ourselves, that we use sex, alcohol, drug, whatever to medicate, we need to be able to identify it. And we see that in SA just like you see it in AA.
Right.
What I like about SA, though, also is that if I'm struggling that day, and it's been a long time, that, you know, that maybe a drink would be really nice I can share it in a meeting. Whereas in an AA meeting, if you don't talk about alcohol, you're going to probably hear about it, unfortunately. You know, you can't bring up, and that's one of the problems, I think, why men especially have struggled in AA with sex addiction, because they can't talk about it.
Right.
Whereas I think you can talk about alcohol or drug problems. Not, again, it's not why you're there, but if you bring it into it, nobody's going to say anything.
So there just seems like there's a lot more space. And I would say, I would agree, this is what I've found in other programs or fellowships, is that there is more space for the intersection of how these different parts of us all impact our life, right? Because if I'm taxed from my drug addiction, I really don't have the resources to work on the recovery from sex addiction, right? Like when I drink alcohol, I tend to act out more on my sex addiction. Like there's all these ways they intersect, and it really does make it impossible. I don't want to say impossible. It makes it really, really difficult to treat when you can't talk about them all at the same time and how they interact and interoperate with each other.
I would agree. I mean, as I said, my story is that one led to the other, and
right.
You hear the hamster wheel, and it keeps going faster and faster. That was my story.
Do you happen to know off the top of your head when Sexaholics Anonymous came to be?
There is a booklet. Roy recognized he had a problem with sex addiction. He had affairs and stuff. He tried to talk about it at an AA meeting. He did connect with people, and this was in the mid-'70s.
Okay.
He finally started a few groups after an AA meeting. They would stay and talk about their sex addiction.
Cool.
In the late 70s. It really, the founding begins early, maybe 81, where he actually starts to have some, true meetings.
Right.
So that's that time frame. There's not a specific date that I
gotcha. Right, kind of like that 10-year span of like the mid early 70s on. That's a really cool story actually about how it came to be. I like that.
Yeah, a lot of his story is in the White Book, and it's pretty fascinating.
I did find it funny though when you said that lust was the word used in the first step. I was like, it would take an old AA guy to pull out an old word like that. Like I don't think people use lust a lot anymore in modern vernacular.
There you
go? Not really. I don't know. Maybe I just hang around my teenagers too much.
Yeah,
they're definitely not using that.
I'm glad you asked when it was founded, because I was wondering about that too. So you got sober in 2007,
correct?
And so I was still drinking then. But I remember sex addiction becoming like popular. Do you guys remember this? Like it was in like pop culture more. There was that TV show Californication with David Duchovny. Do you remember this?
No.
Okay, so he was a sexaholic.
I was stuck in NA. It was like one disease, one fellowship. Like that other shit's all bullshit. Like,
but I remember that being like a hot topic because it was. And then David Duchovny was in that show, and then he came out as a sexaholic. Do you remember that? And then Tiger Woods got in a car accident.
We all know about Tiger.
He blamed, sex addiction as part of his problem. So I remember it being kind of trendy, which, that's a weird thing to say to addiction, but actually it's kind of a miracle that it got trendy because it brought it to the light for people to get help. I looked it up. SA was founded in 79. It didn't, I don't know. I don't remember it being in pop culture.
Again, to quote Pat Carnes, sex addiction, it's 50 years behind AA.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and sadly, there are therapists today who don't think sex addiction is an addiction.
I wondered about that. Like if people treat it like sometimes, you can't get addicted to weed. You can't get addicted to sex. If people treat it that way.
Yeah, it's because the argument is it's not officially listed in the DSM-5, and I don't know if it's 6 is out yet or.
No, it's 5R. It's the
not in
second one. No.
Nope.
No, it's really tricky. There's a group of people who subscribe to the idea that because processes in themselves aren't addictive, even though they create the same exact thing in your brain that the drugs or the alcohol does, that they can't be considered an addiction because it's a choice, I guess. I really can't figure out what their argument is, honestly.
Is it a behavior addiction? Is sex addiction considered a behavior addiction?
They call them process
Process
addictions.
addictions,
Okay.
the term. Yeah.
They only recognize a couple, like trichotillomania, where you can't stop pulling hairs out of your head or your face. It's one of the only few process addictions
What about
recognized.
food?
Food is in various ways, but not
A process addiction or a regular? I'd say regular
It's
addiction. I don't know
called
if that's fair to say, but
eating disorders, I guess.
Yeah.
Disordered eating.
It would be considered, I think, a process. I've always called it that.
Yeah, it's tricky, but
well, and I guess it falls into the category of like things that, and I guess sex you don't have to do, but there are some natural things that people do, eating, sex, for reproduction, things like that, versus like when I do drugs, that's very, I'm going to use the word unnatural. Like that's not a thing that just everybody does, so.
Well, I mean, I've been to a couple of workshops and stuff, and I learned more about the brain than I probably ever wanted to. But they put, pictures of brains on drugs and pictures on pornography, and nobody could see a difference.
Yeah, They look the same.
Yeah,
So it's all the same. I mean, and again, it's, why, that was my alcohol, why I never really addressed it was I had an uncle who was what I call true alcoholic. I mean, he drank a quart to a half a gallon of vodka a day, kept a half a gallon of vodka beside the bed for, he was older, get up in the middle of the night to relieve himself, choke. He was the alcoholic. My drinking, but I did it for the same reason, to get out of my feelings, to be disconnected. And it took me a while in recovery to realize, I did it for the very same reason. I just didn't drink as much, but it allowed me to deny that I had a problem.
It's kind of fascinating in a way, because you'll have the experts debating about whether sex addiction is a real thing or really exists. And then you go to some sort of meeting that talks about it, or you go to an informational seminar like you're talking about, and then you learn that sex addiction is kind of harder to treat, because Billy, if you want to get high, you have to think about the idea that you want to get high and then make some moves to go get money, go get the stuff, whatever, this, that, and the other. There's a lot of time in there for you to catch yourself. Sex addiction, you catch somebody out of the corner of your eye getting off the bus and 3 minutes later you done got high. You're your own drug dealer.
Right.
Like, you don't have to go anywhere to get that. So it's really, really tricky to try to interrupt that fast process. And it's so much harder to stop in some ways because of that. And yet we want to debate whether it's a real thing or not.
I mean, that's why relapse, unfortunately, in SA and all of them, I'm sure, is that, if I want to drink, I got to go make a decision, get in the car, go to the liquor store, actually walk in, buy the bottle, put it on, all those steps. I got at least a shot, hey, maybe this isn't the best thing, or call somebody.
Right.
But with sex addiction, all I do is close my eyes and I can,
Yeah.
Or as you said, somebody, walks in. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it seems like our culture now is so much more like over sexualized, with, it's like celebrated as far as sexuality, and I don't know, not that sexuality is bad, but there's the level that you can find what would have been deemed pornographic 20 years ago. Like now that's like commonplace on Instagram or whatever. Like that stuff is just so readily available.
Yeah. And that's the other part. I mean, social media can, and that's one area for my own recovery, I don't do, but, absolutely. I mean, you got, pictures and stuff that's totally inappropriate, and, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's celebrated. I mean, look at people have commented, and I didn't watch it, the Super Bowl halftime show. There were some moves that I've heard that were not exactly encouraging.
Right. I think, Rick, maybe a really important thing we want to cover before we have to run out of time here. Like, you didn't necessarily notice when you had this intervention. You maybe had some thoughts here and there that sex addiction was a thing or possibly a problem for you, but not really. What kind of ways or things might the average or typical person be looking for in their life that they're not seeing now that maybe is evidence that, like, they might want to talk to somebody about it? You know, maybe it's not a problem, maybe it is, but maybe it's like there's some certain warning signs that you didn't notice that you're aware of now that could help people recognize sooner that maybe they have some kind of sex addiction or disordered interactions with sex.
Good question. For me, I guess the question would be, it's not necessarily how often, but how is it controlling your life? As I said, I've heard people, and this is a question I've asked newcomers. When you view porn, oh yeah, I was only going to do it for 10 minutes, and it was 4 hours later. I'm only going to do it on Sundays or Saturdays or whatever day. All of a sudden, I'm doing it 3 and 4 and 5 times a week. Is it trying to get the idea, is it controlling your life, that unmanageability part in step one, but to kind of awaken them. But for me, it's also sharing my own story a little bit that, oh yeah. And being honest and saying, hey, I didn't think I had a problem until I heard that I did, because that's how we can carry the message. Is the most powerful part is telling our own story.
Just realizing that Sexaholics Anonymous has a little test, just to read a couple of these off that might be useful.
The 20 questions, yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like sex or stimuli are controlling you? That's one you just mentioned. Have you tried to stop or limit what you're doing, or felt that what you were doing was wrong? Do you resort to sex to escape, relieve anxiety, or because you can't cope? Do you feel guilt or remorse or depression afterwards? Has your pursuit of sex become more compulsive? Does it interfere with relations with your spouse? Do you have to resort to images or memories during sex? But yeah, I think there's quite a few more. I will make sure to put that link up underneath our show notes. I think for me, one of the things that was hard for me to admit or own or see, I guess, about myself at that point in time in my life was that it was really calling the shots. Like, I have this tendency, and I think this is a pretty human trait, that we act and then we create the reasons why we acted later, even though we think we do it in the other order. And what I would do is I just kept having good justifications, good rationalizations for why I did these things that I wasn't so happy about later, right? Like, oh, well, I did it because of this, and it's just a shame it didn't work out better for me. And maybe just that better self-reflection would have helped me, or more ability to hear those around me who were pointing it out, like, dude, you're a little off the hook there. Maybe you should look at yourself, right? Like, I don't know. And like you said, I think one of the struggles was that for me, sex addiction was such a hidden behavior. Like, I wasn't really telling all my network or my sponsor about every little thing I did because, like, it wasn't none of their business in my mind. And it was awkward and weird. And maybe in that, just one of the things we need to do is normalize the conversation around sex or sex addiction. Like, just be able to talk about it more without the stigma would be nice.
I think you're right. I mean, but I think also hearing, being with people who are willing to share. I mean, most people are not very open about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I try to be as much as I can.
I get it.
Again, I don't go blab it to big groups, but there's certainly, if anybody, they know I'm in recovery. If they ask, I share. And, and being able to do that kind of breaks down, because it again, as I said, shame is such a,
right.
And shame is, hey, yes, did I do bad things? Absolutely. But I am not a broken, worthless human being.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, addicts and sex addicts probably get it in spades, that I am just worthless.
Man, I am in such agreement because every so often I will share about the fact that I've gone to sex addiction meetings or that I have, some kind of history with that on the show, knowing that people out in the world are hearing that, right? But a lot of times I don't. And it takes somebody like you come on and I'm like, all right, you know what? I'm here with Rick. Like, I don't have to be alone in this. And it is easier to say, I did this. I went to these meetings. I sought help for this. So I think you're right. Like, it's going to take me and you and other people speaking up about it and trying to lower that shame level.
I mean, that's why I came. It's because to carry the message.
Right.
Because and I know, let's face it, we just went through the pandemic. Porn usage jumped 30 to 40%.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, again, not everybody's going to be addicted. I get that. Hey, people drink and don't get addicted.
Right.
People use oxycodone and don't get addicted. But there is a percentage that got introduced to it that now it's controlling them.
What would be the best way to find out more? Like, say you're in a 12-step program or you're not, and you happen to listen to this podcast and you're like, I got some questions about that. I would imagine there's a good route to finding where the closest meeting is, but maybe even this telephone line you said could help direct people in their questioning.
Yes, there's SA.org is the international group.
Okay.
Anybody in the Baltimore area, there's BaltimoreSA.org.
Okay.
That is our Baltimore area webpage, and it has the hotline number on it. You can either call or text in.
Oh, cool. So you can even text and get answers, right?
Yeah.
That's good for my generation.
Yeah, it's I've learned that it's a pretty good tool. And we have started a newcomers meeting on Zoom.
Nice.
It's on Thursday nights every other week, and we can connect you to that. And we do it a little bit like a meeting, but it's not totally not. You can ask questions,
right? And
share a little bit of your story, and it's a good experience. And it's something. Hey, the pandemic had a lot of negative. That encouraged us to go that way, and I think it's a positive.
Wow,
and
that's
just
pretty cool.
One more quick question, because I think this deterred me from going to AA early on. So I got in recovery very young, and when I went to AA meetings, it was like, well, that's just a bunch of old people. In SA meetings, are you seeing a younger demographic with all the porn issues and with the pandemic?
Yes, I think the more recent members have been younger. Now you have to be 18.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. I didn't know that.
Because of the nature of it.
Right.
Yeah. It's just, it's something that's, for safety purposes for everybody.
Do you happen to know, is that for SAA and SLAA too? Because I don't ever remember
I
hearing
don't
it.
know.
That's so fascinating. I mean, it makes sense. It's just interesting. I never thought about it.
Well, because you have Alateen and, you have a lot of, other ones. But yes, sex addiction. And that's one of the reasons, one of the workshops I went to, they talked about researching young kids. Mm-hmm. They can't really do because of, the nature of it and, abuse.
The legality.
Yeah.
Huh. Let's see how bad this is for kids. We'll just show them all a bunch of images.
Yeah.
Measure their brains. Right. Rick, I'm going to ask this, and it's not to be offensive. I'm just trying to explore this, and I think it makes it even more interesting because of your, background at this point in your life. It felt a little, I think, for me, in hearing about Sexaholics Anonymous, with maybe the literature not being as welcoming to the LGBTQ community, and with the kind of strict bottom line around this being your marital partner, it felt like there wouldn't be as much freedom in deciding your higher power. like it kind of felt like those ideals came from sort of Christianity to some extent, and it didn't feel like it would be, in my mind, I was like, oh, if I go there, they're not going to let me believe in something else or feel like something else is my higher power. Does that feel like the vibe in your experience with it, or is that maybe a little off base?
It's probably a little off base. I've actually had a sponsee who was an atheist.
Awesome.
So, and he's struggling in that area some,
Right.
but his parents were huge atheists. And, and I said, hey, yeah, if you want to say the group is your higher power, because it is a power greater than yourself.
Absolutely.
And then that's working for you, for now, that's fine.
Billy likes the one of, or maybe I just keep giving this one to Billy, of like, if I wanted to carry a couch to the second floor of my house, I can't do that. But like, maybe me and Billy could do that, and that's a power greater than me, right? No, I like that we cleared that up or clarified that, actually, because that was one of the hesitations I had about going. So hopefully that won't have to hold anybody else.
No, I don't think, is it a, Christian based? No.
Okay.
Roy, I suspect, had faith. I've, never pursued looking. Certainly, in my own background, yes, my higher power is God.
Right.
I'm very open about it. When I introduce myself, I'm grateful for another day of God's sobriety. And they know. And that's fine. Nobody says one word, but if somebody else isn't quite there yet, that's fine.
You mentioned the virtual meeting for newcomers that you guys have, and I imagine there's probably some other virtual meetings going on. Are there also in-person meetings in the Baltimore area? And if so, about how many are there?
We have 24 meetings. We have probably 3 or 4, 5, I think, Zoom or phone meetings still. A couple were created because of the area we cover.
Right.
Certain part of it, they decided they liked that. So there's a in-person meeting that they had gone to. Afterwards, they now have a Zoom meeting. So we added that. The majority of meetings are in person. There are probably 3 or 4 or 5 that are hybrid, that have a Zoom or a phone component. A couple of them are pretty good. I mean, they've mastered the technology.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's again, a blessing maybe from the pandemic. We were able to use this tool.
Right. No, that's awesome. Is there anything you were hoping to make sure you expressed today about the program, or about who might want to think about considering going and learning more? Like, is there anything you were thinking you wanted to share that we haven't covered?
I think we pretty much covered a lot of it. I mean, again, I would want to stress that is, hey, I understand that, it is that shame-based. I mean, when I connect with somebody, if they want to come to one of my meetings, I'll actually wait outside of the meeting and walk them in. I recognize that. I mean, I've heard stories, I showed up on the parking lot 3 times before I even had the courage to walk in.
Right.
I don't, I want to try to make it as welcoming because, I've been there. I know it's scary, but I know the life change.
Right.
As I said, I was in my late 50s when I got in recovery. These last 15 years have been the best of my life. Marriages, we've just celebrated actually 51 years now of marriage.
Congratulations.
That would not have happened if it hadn't been for recovery. I've been able to help people. I've been able to, when I look in the mirror in the morning, I like who I see now. That's the kind of, I want to help people to get to that point. And I've been there. I look at I remember the days when I look in the mirror like, or coming from a strip club, literally on 95 saying, who was that idiot? Shoving dollar bills down
right where they don't
girls' garters. And as soon as you stop stuffing them, they wouldn't even talk with you. I mean, those crazy behaviors. and saying, "Oh, I'll never do it again."
Mm.
A week later, how can I get out of the house
Right.
to do it again?
Right.
And I shame myself. So I want to try to, hopefully people hear this is, hey, yeah, I get the shame, but there is a better way of life.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming in, Rick. This was really a nice conversation. And I hope people out there can have the safe space and time to sit back and just, ask themselves some of these questions. And maybe if some of those questions really hit home, maybe go on SA's site or look underneath this podcast. I'll have the link right there. You can click on it and go check it out. And maybe you'll end up texting or calling Rick if you're in the Baltimore area and you're reaching out for help. Rick, again, thank you so much. And thank you for just being this person in the world and doing this work.
Thank you guys for having this opportunity.
Awesome. Enjoy the rest of your day, okay?
Okay.
Bye. Did you like this episode? Share it with people you think might get something out of it. Check out the rest of our episodes at recoverysortof.com. Also, while you're there, you can find ways to link up with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, YouTube, anything. We're always looking for new ideas. Got an idea you want us to look into? Reach out to us.